History rarely warns when it is about to turn, and almost no one notices while they are living through it. To understand the present, we need to return to the moment when everything still seemed normal. I invite you to travel with me now.
In 1700, while much of the European world lived with fear, instability, and uncertainty, there existed an empire whose greatest obsession was not the future, but order. A place where repetition mattered more than innovation, where the past was respected as a survival manual, and where millions of people woke up every day believing the world had already reached its ideal form. That place was China. Imagine opening your eyes in a walled city, still before sunrise. The sound does not come from hurried carriages or noisy factories, but from footsteps, low voices, and activities that follow a rhythm known for generations. Nothing seems improvised. Nothing seems urgent. Life does not run. It flows within invisible rules accepted by everyone. In 1700, China did not see itself as one country among others. It saw itself as the center of the world, literally. Everything beyond its borders was considered peripheral, incomplete, or temporary. The Qing Empire governed a vast, populous, and extremely organized territory. The dominant feeling was not fear of collapse, but confidence in continuity. The Chinese cities of that era were not chaotic in the European sense. They were dense, crowded, intense, but ordered. Narrow streets filled with merchants, porters, scholars, and government officials. Each person seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Hierarchy was not only political, it was moral, familial, and spiritual. No one woke up asking, "Who can I become?" The question was different. How should I behave? An individual's value did not lie in originality, but in the ability to maintain harmony. Breaking order was more serious than personal failure. The empire functioned like an ancient machine, adjusted over centuries. The emperor was not seen merely as a ruler, but as a mediator between heaven and earth. His role was to guarantee balance. If harvests failed, if rivers overflowed, or if revolts arose, this was not only a political problem, it was a sign that something was out of balance in the universe. Most of the population would never see the emperor, yet they felt his presence in everything. In laws, rituals, taxes, the calendar, writing, and the way one spoke to elders. Authority did not need to be constantly reinforced. It was already internalized. In the countryside, life was harsh, but predictable. Peasants worked small plots of land passed down from generation to generation. Success did not mean becoming wealthy, but surviving without drawing attention. The worst thing that could happen was not being poor. It was breaking stability. Families were the core of everything. The individual existed within the collective. Parents, grandparents, and ancestors shaped decisions. Honoring the dead was as important as caring for the living. Time was not seen as a straight line, but as a cycle. What had worked before was expected to work again. Unlike Europe, where new ideas were beginning to challenge tradition, China in 1700 viewed innovation with suspicion. Not because it was incapable of creating, but because it believed it had already achieved enough. True knowledge was found in ancient texts, in the classics, in the examples of the past. State officials were chosen through rigorous examinations based on memorization and interpretation of classical texts. It did not matter where you came from, but how deeply you mastered traditional thought. It was a system that rewarded mental discipline, not boldness. Urban life followed clear rules. Markets had defined hours. Professions were inherited. Public behavior was observed. Social shame was a powerful tool of control. Few needed to be punished harshly because most people controlled themselves. At night, cities changed rhythm. Gates closed. Lanterns illuminated specific paths. Silence had value. There was not the constant sense of danger seen in many European cities. There was surveillance, but also predictability. Even in the face of challenges, localized famine, recurring diseases, regional tensions, the empire maintained an appearance of solidity. China in 1700 did not look like a world on the brink of collapse. It looked like a world convinced it would continue existing in the same way for a long time. And perhaps that was the greatest contrast with other parts of the planet. While some places were driven by the urgency to change, China was driven by the conviction to remain. But behind this admirable order, there were silent questions. What happens when a world believes it has already reached its peak? What is lost when stability becomes more important than adaptation? And what happens when external forces begin to pressure a system that was not built to change quickly? Those questions still had no answers in 1700. For those who lived there, the world made sense. Routine felt eternal. Order felt natural. The past felt sufficient. They did not know they were living at the height of a delicate balance. If you stayed longer in China in 1700, you would begin to notice something that does not appear at first glance. Order was not merely a cultural choice. It was a necessity. Everything in that vast empire depended on people remaining in the place assigned to them. Harmony carried a silent cost. Inside homes, life was rigidly organized. The family was not a space of spontaneous affection, but of duty. Every gesture, every word, every decision followed an ancestral logic. The eldest decided. The youngest obeyed. Questioning was not seen as courage, but as moral failure. Women lived almost entirely confined to the domestic sphere. Their existence rarely left written records. They were responsible for maintaining internal family order, raising children, respecting in-laws, and preserving the honor of the clan. Obedience was a virtue. Silence was protection. Marriage was not a meeting of desires, but of family strategies. Love could emerge, but it was never the priority. What mattered was maintaining balance between families, land, and reputation. Individual happiness was secondary to collective stability. Children grew up surrounded by clear expectations. From an early age, they learned that the world was not meant to be questioned, but understood and accepted. Education did not encourage creativity in the modern sense, but memorization, discipline, and self-control. Thinking too far outside the pattern was dangerous. Confucianism was not just a philosophy, it was the backbone of society. It taught that chaos arises when each person seeks their own interests. Virtue lay in fulfilling the correct role, at the correct moment, in the correct way. This created a highly functional society, but also an extremely rigid one. At the top of this system, the emperor was seen as the Son of Heaven. His power did not come only from armies or laws, but from the belief that he maintained cosmic balance. If something went wrong in the empire, the blame did not fall only on local administrators, but on the overall harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. Because of this, natural signs carried political weight. Droughts, floods, epidemics, or famines were interpreted as warnings, not merely practical problems, but messages that something was out of order. Governing meant interpreting the world. The imperial bureaucracy was vast and detailed. Officials recorded nearly everything. Writing was power. Whoever controlled the records controlled administrative reality. The empire appeared solid because it constantly observed itself. But that observation had limits. Most people lived their entire lives in the same place. Few traveled long distances. The outside world was known more through reports than through experience. This reinforced the sense that the empire was complete unto itself. What came from outside was rarely seen as necessary. Trade existed, of course, but it was carefully controlled. Contact with foreigners was limited, monitored, and often treated with suspicion. Not out of immediate fear, but out of cultural conviction. What came from outside could not be superior to what had existed for centuries. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, new ideas were beginning to circulate at increasing speed. Experimental science, mercantile capitalism, military expansion, new forms of social organization, but these transformations still seemed distant, almost irrelevant to those living within the Chinese logic of 1700. The empire was not stagnant. It functioned, and it functioned well within its own parameters. Agricultural production sustained an immense population. Administration maintained relative internal peace. Rebellions were rare at that moment. The prevailing feeling was that the system had defeated time itself. And perhaps for that very reason, few perceived its vulnerabilities. Stability depended on constant balance. Any prolonged external pressure could generate cracks. But how could one imagine that, when for generations the world had been predictable? When history seemed to prove that this model worked, the danger was not extreme misery or immediate collapse. It was the lack of flexibility. A system designed to last forever struggles to react when the environment changes too quickly. In 1700, almost no one in China asked what the world would be like in 100 years. That was not a relevant concern. The future was seen as a continuation of the past, not as rupture. But the world around it was beginning to accelerate. And when change arrives in a place that values permanence above all else, the shock is usually profound. At that moment, however, none of this seemed urgent. Life continued. Harvests came. Rituals were performed. Families maintained their structure. The empire breathed confidence. They did not know that the greatest challenge would not come from within, but from outside. Nor that China's very strength, its order, its tradition, its stability, would also become its greatest vulnerability. Everything still seemed solid. But the silence before transformation is often the deepest. When change finally began to touch the edges of China, it did not arrive as immediate invasion or visible collapse. It arrived as distant noise, an irrelevant detail, something that did not seem to demand urgent response. And perhaps that is why it was so dangerous. At first, there were only vague reports coming from afar. Merchants speaking of new routes, new weapons, new forms of organization, ideas that sounded strange, exaggerated, or simply incompatible with an empire that already saw itself as complete. For China in 1700, the outside world was not a threat. It was a peripheral space, unstable and unrefined. The problem was that the world did not think the same way. While China maintained firm cultural boundaries, other powers learned to move quickly, adapt strategies, and transform knowledge into practical power. The rhythm of the world began to accelerate, and the empire that valued continuity above all else did not feel this acceleration as a warning. It felt it as a distant disturbance. Internal orders still functioned, institutions still existed, rituals were still respected. But the balance sustaining all of this depended on a silent assumption that the world would remain essentially the same. That assumption was about to fail. China had built an admirable system of stability, but it had not developed the habit of rupture. Slow changes were acceptable. Deep transformations were not. The empire knew how to manage the known. It did not know how to respond to the unknown. Over time, external pressures became more frequent. New commercial demands, new political interests, new technologies that altered the logic of power. The world did not ask permission to change. It simply changed. Internally, Chinese society remained organized, but increasingly dependent on nothing going wrong. Any systemic failure, a major agricultural crisis, a prolonged rebellion, an external shock, could reverberate throughout the empire. Solidity concealed a structural fragility, the inability to react quickly. What had once been strength slowly began to turn into rigidity. In 1700, no one spoke of decline. The idea would have seemed absurd. China was still immense, populous, productive, and culturally confident. But history rarely announces its turning points clearly. It seeps into daily life almost invisibly, until it is too late to turn back. The generations who lived during that period believed they were protected by tradition, and for a long time, they were. But tradition, when it turns into a barrier, stops protecting and begins isolating. The modern world did not emerge from a sudden explosion. It was born from silent comparisons, differences in rhythm, and accumulated decisions. While some places invested in constant change, others invested in permanence. No choice is neutral. China in 1700 represents a rare moment in human history. An empire that had solved many of the problems others still faced, but that, precisely because of that success, did not feel the need to change. A world that functioned so well internally that it failed to notice how much the outside was transforming. For those who lived there, life made sense. Routine offered security. Hierarchy provided clarity. The past offered answers. The future did not feel urgent. But history does not move according to the comfort of societies. It moves according to greater forces, often invisible at the moment they begin. What came later does not erase the greatness of that world. On the contrary, it makes it even more impressive. China in 1700 did not fall because of ignorance or immediate weakness. It was challenged because the world around it began to operate under different rules. And this may be the most unsettling point of this journey through time. Civilizations do not disappear only when they fail. Sometimes they disappear because they succeeded too well, within a world that no longer exists. If you had been there, in 1700, you would not have felt the end approaching. You would have felt only continuity, normality, order. And that is exactly what makes this story so powerful. Because the greatest turning points in human history are rarely perceived while they are happening, they only become clear when they are already behind us.
I invite you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where you'd like us to travel next. See you in the next video.